Why might a backup program talk about sector by sector backups? Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. Here's a question that I got recently, and to be honest, it's a question I've seen multiple times before. I got this message from my backup program. Checking the partition found errors on one partition without drive letter, unknown partition. Click OK to create a sector by sector backup or cancel the backup. What does that mean? Is my backup going to work? First of all, yes, your backup will work. The message, or some variations on it, can be benign. In fact, it's often benign. Or it can indicate a problem with the disk itself. Exactly how it's reported depends on the backup software you're using. This can come from multiple different tools. But the concept is actually fairly consistent. To understand this message, we really do need to understand a little bit about how your files are put on a disk and then how that disk is typically backed up. At the lowest level, disks are organized as a collection of empty boxes, or what are called sectors, into which the operating system can write the data. For example, here's a grid. I've got 15 sectors. They're all 512 bytes in size. If this were a real disk, this disk would hold 7,680 bytes. It's not very big, but of course it's great for our examples. When you write a file to a disk, the space on that disk is allocated one sector at a time. This means a file that is 1,025 bytes in size, 512, 512 plus 1, will occupy 3 sectors. Now, if you recall the concept of fragmentation, you'll understand that the file doesn't have to be organized in sequence. Those 3 sectors can be basically strewn about the hard disk in almost any order. For example, here in this image, we've got part 1 at the beginning, part 2 somewhere down further, and then part 3 somewhere in between. We've got another file which has 4 parts that are similarly distributed across the physical surface of this disk. And that other file, that second file, this time it's 1,600 bytes in size, which means it takes 4 sectors. Again, 512 plus 512 plus 512 plus 64. 4 sectors. Now, keeping track of where all of those parts are is the job of the file system format. In Windows, that's most commonly NTFS, but it can include other formats like exFAT, FAT32, or something called ext4, which is often used in Linux-based systems. Now, a normal backup understands file systems, and it backs up files one file at a time. This is true for simple file copy style backups, as well as for the system image backups that I so strongly recommend. A system image of the second example with those 2 files might look something like this. You'll notice that the image doesn't reflect at all how the files were laid out on the disk, or even how they were organized into sectors. It's simply 1,025 bytes of file 1 followed by 1,600 bytes of file 2. There's no wasted space. Each file takes only the room it needs within the image. This, like I said, requires that the backup tool understands how the files are laid out. In other words, it's got to understand NTFS, exFAT, FAT32, and so on. When backing up sector by sector, the backup tool essentially ignores what the disk contains or how things are organized. As the term implies, a sector by sector backup backs up each sector on the hard disk in turn. So a sector by sector backup of our original example disk above might look something like this. You can see the files are kind of spread out within the backup, and those white boxes represent empty sectors, sectors that they're not currently being used, but they still have whatever was in them before when they were used previously. A sector by sector backup copies all of that. Again, The sectors containing the data, as well as the unused sectors, are all written to the backup without any regard or knowledge of exactly what the data might even mean. Okay, why is your backup program talking about sector by sector? Well, there are generally two most common reasons. One, it doesn't understand the format. Remember, I said that the backup program needs to understand the underlying disk format, like NTFS. If the disk doesn't use a format that the backup program recognizes, then a sector by sector backup is the only way that backup program can possibly back up that partition. A Windows-based backup program trying to back up a disk formatted with Linux's ext4 could cause this, since Windows doesn't understand ext4. And this can also be the case if the disk isn't formatted at all. The other scenario is errors. Now, in the original question, the backup program reported an error on the disk being backed up. Usually, though not always, this is the equivalent of check disk reporting an error. Because there's an error, the backup program cannot trust that the disk formatting information is correct. As a result, the only safe thing to do is to back up the disk sector by sector. Now, a backup that is sector by sector is sometimes referred to as a forensic backup. This is because, in addition to backing up the data on your hard disk, it backs up the specific physical layout of the data, the file system overhead and tracking information, and the data that remains in those unused, empty, or free sectors. This type of backup can then be used to do things like undelete files or perform other types of data recovery without affecting the original disk from which the backup was created. Okay, so you're setting up a backup, and your backup program informs you that one of your disks will have to be sector by sector backup. What should you do? Let the backup proceed. Seriously, there's nothing wrong. What happens after the backup is complete will depend on a few things, but let the backup happen. There is no harm in letting it happen, and it will result in a backup of what the backup program was able to see. Now, sometimes it does make sense for a backup program to choose a sector by sector approach. In fact, it's so normal that some programs might not even mention it, other than perhaps in a log. For example, here's a disk layout. I've got 3 partitions. I've got 100 megabyte EFI system partition up above. I've got in the middle my NTFS partition that is the C drive. And then I've got this recovery partition at the end. It doesn't really say what format it is. It may be a completely different format. It may be raw data. We just don't know. If the backup program also can't know, then the only thing it could do is back it up sector by sector. And because this is common, because it was at least able to identify it as a recovery partition, it might not bother to tell us. That might just be the way these partitions get backed up. And again, sometimes it is the result of an error of some sort, particularly if that error is in a data partition, like the C drive in the example above. Then yeah, further investigation into the state of that drive is called for after the backup is complete. That investigation usually begins with check disk. So I can't really give you a blanket recommendation on what to do when you see a backup program indicate that it's going to perform a sector by sector backup when you didn't expect one, other than to say, pay attention to the drive on which it's happening. It can be an error, or it can be benign. Use the specifics of the drive and the details in any error messages to guide what you do next. But at least you now know what the heck they're talking about. For updates, for comments, for links related to this topic and more, visit askleo.com/178870. I'm Leo Notenboom, and this is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.